This policy seminar is on the impact of global change on food security in 2050 and looking at the risks through the lens of food trade. The question that this seminar and this work tackles on the role of trade in achieving food security in an increasingly uncertain world is a really important question, and one that we're grappling with in a number of different ways as we do our work here at IFPRI. And this project is one of the projects that's really helped us think through this. We've been really happy to collaborate on this Jameel-funded project for the past 3 years with MIT, Oxford, and other partners. The project's to help deepen our understanding of the multiple dimensions of food security, including the critical role played by trade. IFPRI's role in this project has been to help look at how future changes in demand and production could affect countries' reliance on imports for food security. This includes projections on the future impacts of climate change on food production, not only domestically, but also in current and prospective trading partners around the world. As you're going to hear, our projections indicate that food imports will become increasingly important in many low and middle income countries, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa, in the next several decades. And this increasingly important role of trade is a key emphasis for us, and these results help underscore the importance of policy and investment decisions that are consistent with this, and particularly in how we can reduce the cost of trade, reduce the uncertainty around a free trading system. Increasing trade tensions at the moment bring the security of trade also into question. A lot of this work's focused on the risk coming from climate uncertainty, but we have to recognize that this is not the only source of risk we're facing. And this is something that we can get to as the results are presented and as we go into the discussions. And this work really helps us think about these trade-offs, the trade-offs and the different sources of risk and uncertainty, how technological change can help, and how effective policy advice and work can also help. So without further ado, I'm very happy to hand over to the presenters who are going to run through a presentation of this work, and then we'll have time to discuss some of the important issues they raise afterwards. Thank you again for joining, and welcome.
Thank you, Ruth, and thank you for all who are here in person and those online. And we're excited today because this is a hybrid seminar, and the purpose is interaction. So we have been involved for 3 years on this project, which we'll summarize very briefly. There are a series of papers and a website so you can get more information. So we're just going to be the tip of the iceberg on the things today. But we're looking, as we've come to the final finish line of this project, we want your input about where do we go? Have we missed things? What did we forget? What we didn't do? What didn't we emphasize on? As we look forward for doing the next steps, we want your input on that. So we're very excited this morning. The form of this is going to be a quick 25 to 30 minute summary of the findings of the report. And then we're really excited that we have a panel of top trade people coming from academic and research side all the way to the private sector and the investment side. So we'll be having this dialogue with the panel, and then we'll have time for questions at the end. So basically, if you have questions on the presentation, remember them, write them, jot them down, and then there'll be time. And for online, we have mechanism for you to send in your questions. So this is a dialogue that we want to happen. So we're really excited about that. And great. So the Jameel Index, as again, it's really appropriate that we're here at IFPRI, in that the reason that this project went through was the linkages between all the partners on the screen here were working in different ways, and they were brought together through the moderator of our panelists and the lead of this project, Greg Sixt, who you will meet in a few moments, and through something called the FACT Alliance, which is the Food and Climate Transition Alliance, bringing researchers together to where the sum is greater than the parts. And that really is what's happened here. And we don't have time to go through, but we worked jointly with IFPRI, which were our modelers, and we'll hear more about that, with the Oxford Martin School and Jim Hall in the School of Geography and Environment. We're pleased to have Dana Hogue with us here from Colorado State, who's a member of this, and we are and one of our colleagues at the United Arab Emirates University. And then we are very thankful for Community Jameel, which not only was a funder of this, they provided the funding, but also their staff was directly involved in both the design and the dissemination of the work. So we are very thankful for this group. Food trade vulnerability. So what started this work was, as we look around, food security is something that's really important to many of us. And the question is, what is the role of trade in food security? But in that, while we were preparing for this, a number of things have happened which are in the news. This is a picture of the Evergreen tanker stuck in the Suez Canal. So why it was stuck, all the food and grain, which was coming from the Black Sea, from Russia and Ukraine, couldn't get to the Gulf, or if that's their path to Asia, couldn't get there. So there's this a maritime choke point, as there's some others around. But then right in the middle of it, we had a conflict on the Black Sea. And so the sources of supply for a number of grains, that was disrupted. And then we now know with geopolitics and other things, so you may have a plan for your food to be part of your food security coming through trade, but it can be incredibly vulnerable, and that's what we were looking at. And then that's sort of the current vulnerability, and we can think of climate shocks, droughts, and floods. How does that impact it? But then we wanted to look ahead, and so we're all concerned about climate change and what it could mean. So we wanted to look ahead into 2050 and said, what are the risks that climate change may bring to this? And as we did it, one of the things we were looking at is climate change doesn't take place on what we are now, it takes place on what the world is going to be in the future. So we talk about it as global change. There's going to be population growth, economic growth, political change, and then the climate is changing on top of that. So we wanted to look across those risks, which is what we'll talk about today. So we wanted to do something. There are a lot of different indicators or indices on food security, and that actually entered our role, and we'll see some about that later. But what we were trying to do is look at the risk. So the whole point is, how risky is this? And we came up with a framework, which is the goal is to be transparent and to be as simple as possible. So what we did is we have 5 what we call meta indicators. So we have variables that bring in information. We combine those variables in different ways to be indicators. And then we made meta indicators where we look across all of these different crops and things to come up with these 5 factors that go into risk. One is food import dependency. So what percentage of your food is imported? And when we look at there's an equation there, that's the only one you'll see all day. But the W is that we weight them by how important that food is in your diet. So you may import 100% of bananas, but that's 0.01% of your diet. It's not as important as if you're importing 90% of your wheat or your rice. So we weight those. So then is feed. So we know a lot of countries like Saudi Arabia has a big domestic livestock production, but it's all based on imported feed. So when we look at animal proteins, we want to look at the feed coming in. So those are 2 that drive us in terms of that. The other thing we've seen is that if you're importing food, you have to pay for that. Do you have the foreign exchange to pay for that? And we all know little economics, what we call the shadow price. You may have the money in your local currency, but there can be a big debate at the national bank to get foreign exchange. And if you're growing, you want technology, you want other things that you want to import, energy, how much foreign exchange you have. Then the other thing is, how reliable are your partners? If you're importing something from a country that has widely varying floods and droughts, and their production may be high on average, but it's from year to year, that's a risk to you. What is your partner's supply? And then finally, what we call the supply chain robustness, which was something Egypt learned about, where almost half of their grains were coming from Russia or Ukraine, and then there's a shock on that. that's your risk. So we look at this supply chain risk. So this is what we did. We came to this, and then one of the key things here is we used what we call a geometric mean, and this came from standing on the shoulders of all who looked at the Human Development Index. And by making it geometric and multiplicative, if one of your 5 are low, it's going to bring you down. You can't compensate for that in that. So that's all in a report that you'll see here. We have a website, jameelindex.mit.edu. There is actually the whole index is there. You can look at it in tabular form. You can change the weights, make your own index, however, and a lot of the documents that we're drawing from today will be there. So when we look at it, we look at the global risk of food trade. We classify us into 5 areas, and you can see that your eye is brought directly to Africa and the Gulf region from this, and which is what we might expect. When we looked at this, we said, all right, what's going on if we look at by population? Well, by population, basically 80% of the world is low or very low risk. However, that's driven by a bunch of large countries, India, China, all of Europe, the US. But if you look at it by country, and food policy takes place at country level. So that's why we started looking at that. You see that about 50% of the world is low, but you see 50% is medium, high, or extreme. And so we define you being at risk if you're medium or above. So all the rest of the analysis we're going to talk about today, we're looking at statistics based on the number of countries, so not by population. And one can dive in oneself if they want to look at that, but as we go at that, then the other thing, it's quite different by region. And so as we go forward, we're going to look at that. And what this all brought us to is that what's going on with food trade. So this is then looking at food security in light of the food trade. So along the x-axis is the Jameel Index. So as you move to the right-hand side, you're more vulnerable. And the other one is the percentage of population can afford a healthy diet. That is an indicator that's at the FAO has it on FAO Stat. The higher you are, the better. So you see the world in sort of 4 quadrants. And one of the things we noticed is the low income were not very vulnerable to the Jameel Index. The reason it's not vulnerable is it's not food secure. They can't produce it, and they can't afford to import it. So they're in that lower left-hand corner in that quadrant. And then as you move up to high income and upper middle income, you see we're spreading a course. So the Gulf countries are very food secure, but they have vulnerability. They bring in imports. So you fit in these different worlds, but what we want to look at here is, this is a policy seminar. What are the policies? How do you go from being low Jameel, low security? How do we get up there? Do we do it by self-sufficiency, or we do it by imports? And then the question is, does one size fit all? And so I think some of these are answering questions, but that's where we want to go today and see what did we learn from this, and how do we move forward in the role of trade to get as much of the world up in the food security, and does it matter where you are on left or right? That's a question we have for you all, and we're trying to answer. So the findings that we have, there's no easy path. What do we do? What is sustainable? We've done some separate work that we're not presenting today on how sustainable from an environmental point of view are some of these trade issues that we look at. Self-sufficiency, how do we get there? That's going to take us to close yield gaps. Do we have horizontal expansion, vertical expansion? What do we do? And then if you need imports, you have to have economic growth to pay for them. How do you do that? Is that more sustainable if you have to drive it by energy and all of these things? So as we did that, what we were able to do was look on the left-hand side, we looked on history. So we took historical data. Data exists from 2014 to 2023. The data we use from FAO is always 2 years delayed because they're vetting the data. So right now we can go up to 2023. So we're trying to get trends and things that we've learned from the past. But for many of us in the room, about policy is where do we go in the future? That's what we want to know. And we can do that because of IFPRI. And we're standing on the shoulders of all the great work directed here by the modeling. And one of the key tools is the impact model, and we'll hear from later from Mark Rosegrant, the father and parent of the impact model. So what we want to do is we want to look to the future. But one of the problems, what is the future? So we took a scenario approach and we put it, because climate change is so important and global change, we use the IPCC framework of SSPs and RCPs. So just it's sort of consistent and we can compare against other things that are going on. So what we're going to do in a moment here is, now we have these models, we're going to have our colleagues from IFPRI give us a very brief micro presentation on what are the tools that we used. How did we go from the climate models to yields? How do we take yields and look at supply and demand? And then the key thing we're seeing is bilateral trade. So one of the things we have in this work was we developed a bespoke bilateral trade model, which is the first one, and we will have Sherwin talking to us about that. So with our next slide, we're going to take these models, turn them over to Tim. And Tim, if you'll come up and you can use the arrow to project your slides.
Right. Thank you, Ken. This is very brief. So we're going to cover a few things. First, I want to present the climate models that we use inside the impact model. And these climate models are from the international community, from CMIP and ISIMIP, which is part of the IPCC process of generating results for the big reports that come out every 6 to 8 years. This is the one for temperature change, and what you should note here is the reds, the darker reds are high heat, and the blues and greens are low heat increases. And what you should note is that there's a great deal of difference between the 5 models, and that there's also geographic differences. It's not like one model is simply a scale up of another model. Also, I wanted to show you the rainfall maps and how they vary. You can see, for example, the UK map here has a great deal of rainfall increase across Central Africa and Eastern Africa, whereas the GFDL model projects a very dry future. So what we use is we take these climate models and we put them inside crop models. And we use the DSET crop modeling system. And basically what it requires is daily values for temperature and precipitation and solar radiation. And we can compute at any geographic scale that we choose, but we do our analysis for impact at a half-degree scale, which is approximately 50 kilometers on edge at the equator. And it keeps track of many things: daily growth of the plant, it keeps track of what's going on in the soil with nutrients and water, and it essentially grows the crop inside your computer. And what we do is we compare the beginning period yields to the end period yields and determine the overall impact of climate change from the beginning period to the end period. And so these are the results for rain-fed maize for Africa. We do it for the entire world, but if I showed maps of the entire world, you could hardly see anything, so I just chose to focus on Africa here. I hope you don't mind. And you can see, again, the heat in the UK model really affected southern Africa greatly, and you can see large losses. The reds, dark reds are large losses. But then you look at the NPI model in southern Africa, excuse me, you have green. You have actually gains from climate change. Also, you'll note the highlands of Ethiopia and Kenya and Rwanda. They all generally have a trend towards showing improvement in yields as a result of climate change, because they're slightly too cold right now, and you add a little heat, and the maize really enjoys it. So what we do is we take these pixel-sized, small 50K units, and the impact model functions at a higher level. It functions at the country level, union with major river basins. So there's over 300 units in there. And so what we have to do is aggregate them up. And if there's no maize grown in a certain location, that counts as 0. But if there's a lot of maize, that counts as whatever it is. And so we use the SPAM data set that's produced at IFPRI. And there's a newest version came out recently for 2020. And the left-hand side shows the darker greens are higher concentrations of maize, and of course the whites are no. And then it also includes yields. I throw that as a bonus in there. The SPAM data set is very good about showing us yields too. And I think that's all I had to share.
Great. Thank you. And we are very excited to have us joining remotely, Faika Hartley, who works for IFPRI, but out of the South Africa office, and she's been involved in the global modeling, taking those yields and fitting them with projections of population and economic growth, and what does it mean for supply and demand balance on the globe. So, Faika?
Thanks, Ken. Next slide, please. So the IFPRI impact model was used to simulate the evolution. So it's the slide before that, please.
This one, backward?
Thanks. Yeah, thank you. So the IFPRI impact model was used to simulate the evolution of global food systems to 2050 as an input into the Food and Trade Vulnerability Index outlook. So impact is, sorry, we're on the wrong slide. So if we just go one down. Yes. So impact is a network of linked economic, water, and crop models, as illustrated in the diagram on the left. And these models use the same socioeconomic and climate assumptions to create a consistent projection of food production and trade across 158 countries and 62 agricultural commodities. The core model within this framework is a global partial equilibrium multi-market economic model. And this model simulates national and international agricultural markets, solving for production, demand, and prices that equate supply and demand across the globe. So the links between the core model and the water and crop models, along with the inputs that we include about climate futures and socioeconomic trends, support the integrated analysis of changing environmental, biophysical, and socioeconomic trends on food systems. Next slide, please. So while impact provides a rich sectorial detail, it does not capture full economy-wide feedbacks. And agricultural changes affect incomes, prices, labor markets, and demand across the broader economy. So impact alone cannot fully model all of those interactions. So to address this, we link the impact model with GLOBE, which is a dynamic computable general equilibrium model that covers 17 global regions and 22 production sectors. Impact in GLOBE is linked through agricultural productivity and GDP growth. So agricultural productivity from the impact model is passed to GLOBE to determine the broader economic impacts of changes in the agricultural sector, and the resulting changes in GDP growth from the GLOBE model are fed back to impact to account for the broader impacts on demand. So this combined system allows us to analyze not only the agricultural outcomes, but also macroeconomic impacts, including affordability of imports. Next slide, please. So we considered, is illustrated in the table on the left, and which Ken briefly touched on. So these were chosen such that the simulated projections could provide a range of potential food system pathways. To ensure consistency, the impact and GLOBE models both share common base scenarios. So namely, we use the SSP2 with no climate change. So the first step is that the impact model uses assumptions from the scenario to solve for the base food system pathway. Outputs from the impact model are then aggregated to the structure of the GLOBE model and serve as inputs into calibrating the dynamic baseline of the model. And this ensures that the two models are aligned. So for the remaining scenarios, what we do is only the impact outputs on agricultural productivity are passed to GLOBE to simulate the broader economic impacts. GLOBE GDP outcomes are then downscaled and passed to impact. The process for downscaling is illustrated on the right-hand side of the slide. But in essence, it is based on the observation that in GLOBE, GDP effects are closely correlated to the yield shocks imposed in the model, and this is captured in the variable yield shock index, or YSI. And this is in essence an aggregation of the corresponding index and impact. Initial estimates of the downscaled GDP impacts can therefore be obtained using the coefficient from an OLS regression of income deviations on the yield shock index from GLOBE. This is further refined to ensure that at the aggregate level, the impact changes match those that are found in GLOBE. So it's a very brief overview, but I'll now hand over to Sherwin, who will talk about the bilateral trade model. Thank you.
Thanks, Faika. I'll be describing the work done to gauge supply chain robustness in the Jamil Index, done mainly by projecting countries' bilateral imports and seeing whether there's an issue of high concentration. Next slide, please. High import concentration is distinct from high import dependency. If imports are concentrated in too few countries, importers are susceptible to disruptions from specific risks in their trading partners, natural disasters, economic downturns, geopolitical events, but also long-term reductions in suppliers' ability to meet demand in a context of changing socioeconomic development. Ideally, countries want to source inputs from multiple countries to build flexibility and reduce the risk of supply chain bottlenecks. The more trade partners, the less vulnerable the country is to supply chain shocks. Now, projecting what this could look like in the long term is inherently complex. In gravity models, which are widely applied in trade analysis, trade flows are affected by economic size and distance. In addition, we need to have a sense of how much countries are likely to export or import from the global market. The impact model is a good candidate for this, as it offers long-term projections of commodity net trade. But we also need to respect the existing pattern of trade, which are based on things like historical agreements, cultural relationships, preferences, and other determinants. These can be slow to change, not least because of high transition costs. Next slide, please. So what we're trying to model is how to gradually change prevailing trade patterns to reflect projected changes in economic size and changes in global commodity markets. So in this slide, our novel effort to answer this is what we've called the Impact Bilateral Import Shares Module, or IBIS. In a nutshell, IBIS adjusts trade share priors derived from FAOSTAT trade data to be consistent with market clearing global net trade in impact. We use a cross-entropy minimum to adjust trade weights with two accounting restrictions. One, that global trade is balanced, and two, that country trade is balanced. That is, the exports of one country matches the sum of imports demand for it. In addition to the impact restrictions, the import pattern is influenced by a gravity term, consisting of the market size of the trade pair, as well as geographic distance between them. The market size is expressed as a product of GDP for the trade partners and changes each year in line with the projections used in impact, and geographic distance is assumed fixed across time. The initial import pattern is influenced by historical trade using import shares calculated from an accumulated 10 years for 8 commodity groups. This is our initial prior. In subsequent years, the prior is updated to the solved import pattern of the previous year. Next slide, please. Here's some sample output from the IBIS module, looking at the estimated import shares for maize in Kenya in 2050. The main takeaway here is that one can observe changes in the projected import shares from different countries on the left. Imports from Tanzania, for example, used to make a majority of Kenya's maize imports, but this is projected to shrink by 2050 in the scenario. On the right, we illustrate how this is used in the Jamil Index. Sorted by the largest import source, we see that in 2021, 4 countries made up 80% of Kenya's maize imports. By 2050, we project this to increase to 6. Final slide, please, or at least for my section. So to finish off, I'd like to reiterate that projecting bilateral trade is complex, but can be useful in exploring merging change. IBIS is a new effort at projecting bilateral imports in a way that harmonizes impact results, evolves historical trade relationships, and incorporates projections of market size. Of course, such efforts can benefit from future development, including, for example, a stronger role for bilateral price wedges, to be able to look at issues such as tariffs and transportation costs. And with my time up, I'll hand back to Ken. Thank you very much.
Thank you, all presenters, for getting us to this point, and we will dash ahead through the remaining part, but we'll have questions and answers for, later on if you have that. One of the things we learned from here is if you're working with models, you've got to have a topic that has a vowel in there. So they got IBIS, so they got 2 vowels there. So like impact, so that's a really important thing when you do modeling. When we look at the future, in the world of IPCC, there are these 5 major projections of the future, and they go from a sustainability one, SSP 1, which basically nobody feels we can meet, we're past that, to all the way rapid growth with no concern for energy or climate, that's SSP 5, and there are these other groups. What we have decided to look at for the rest of today is SSP 2 as our main focus that we're going to look at. We can look at 3 And those will be in reports and things that if you want to know, but just for today, we'll focus on that. What we want to see here is the low-income countries. If we look at SSP2 for low-income countries, we go from about 600 million people to about 1.2 billion. There's a doubling in the next 25 years of the population in the low-income countries. If we look then at the lower middle income countries, we have right now about 3 billion people. The projection under SSP2 is over 4 billion. So we have an increase in the next 25 years of 1.8 billion people. How are we going to make that how are they going to be food secure, as well as the rest of the world growing in economic growth? So what we're looking at is what is that demand for food in light of what we're going to see? The upper middle and the high incomes have basically no significant change in their population. So this is all being driven by low and lower middle income countries. If we look at this quickly at this map, trying to rival Tim with nice maps here, is that's the yield gap. So if we look on the left-hand side, that is the darker reds are your ratio to what the industrialized countries are doing with their yields in 10 major crops. So you see Africa was red because it's warmer, but also they're at much lower yields than what we see globally. On the right-hand side is why are there these high yields? Their input use. There's fertilizer use in itself. So as we look forward, and what we're doing in the future work is looking at the sustainability issues of how do we convert Africa? We see it's all low there. How do we increase those yields? Is it by inputs? Is it GMO? What do we do and how do we do it? That's a big policy issue. But here's one of the things that we do. We're starting to get in our results. When we look at climate change, and this is something that depending on if you've been working on this, the world doesn't quite understand is a lot of our reports are out giving results at 2100, which is scary. The World Bank did something called Turning Down the Heat, which was all the results in 2100. Well, look at the range. We can go up to over 5 degrees global warming by the end of the century, and it varies by what path we're on and what are the emissions. But by 2050, we are closely bunched there. And there's the uncertainty, those are basically the same projections there. There's a little bit of uncertainty and it happens from country to country. So as we look to 2050, we see that the climate threat might be different. And if we look at our quick results here, we looked at, if you look at the change, how many countries change from their classification of Jamil. If we just go to 2050 with SSP2, 1.8 billion people, we get 64% of the world stays the same, 7% get better. But when you look at those numbers, almost 30% are increasing their Jamil index or their vulnerability. That's pretty significant. If we go look at 2050 and then do a climate change, we see that 94% of the countries don't move because of the climate. And we only see about 3% moving one. What's going on here? So I'm going to do a quick dive through what do we know and what have we learned from these incredible models that you just heard about here. So this is my spaghetti diagram for the day. And we'll come in and look at that. So again, we have food security on the vertical axis and Jamil on the right. So that's all the countries of the world. And what we see briefly there is where it says mean, there's a slight shift from being at about 0.4 Jamil and 0.6 up to about 0.44 Jamil. Well, there's the means right there. Jamil goes from 3.1 to 3.4, but we have a significant increase in food security. So we're doing better there. But what's happening by country? So these are the low-income countries. And you see they were mostly in the lower quadrant, but they're driving towards that upper quadrant. And how are they doing that? They're doing that through imports. We look here at the middle income, they're moving back and forth. Here's the upper middle, very flat going there. And then here's the higher income. So what we did is to just sort of give you a sense of looking at this. These are your relative changes from now. And what we see is the lower income in the bottom here, they're all almost significantly in that upper direction. The way they're increasing their food securities through imports. We see lower middle, we see some of them starting to reduce their imports because as Tim showed, some countries are doing better at that point, and they're closing their yield gap due to technological change as they get money. We then look at upper middle income, and they start balancing. You get a little bit on each, and then finally the high income countries, just minor changes. So as we look to the future, what's happening here, and something we want to talk about later, is who are the exporters? The super exporters are the high income countries and a few of the lower middle income countries. So as we look at this, what's going on? We then want to look at regions. So we were looking at income. Here's Africa, and we see it looks like it's all going, you have the quadrant, so then we take our look again, and sure enough, basically Africa's path to increasing food security in the next 30 years is in this direction. And why is it going in direction? A quick summary: Uganda is going to double its population in the next 25 years. That's a 3% per year growth. They're not having a 3% growth in their ag productivity. So how are they going to be able to do that? So those are the kind of things which we talked about, and that each country, we then have to drill down, and we've done country by country deep dives in the Jamil. But so if we look at this, let's look at what global change is saying. This is for, I think most of you know what Box and Whisker is. We took the 157 countries that come out of the impact model, and the middle line there is the median, and then that box is where that's between 25% and 75% of the countries are, and then the tails are the rest of the countries. And we look at 2020, and there the Jamil index is about 2.8. And then we look across climate change, global change. These are no climate change at all, just looking at the growth of those different paths. And we see that there's a significant growth that by SSP2 we're above 3. We move from below 3 to above 0.3 at that point, and we see how that impacts that. But if we look at climate change, so the first one, we're here now, we go to 2050 and we have no climate change. Then we look across all the different climate models that Tim showed us. The median hardly changes at all. You can see the tails flicking around in the end of the boxes. There are some individual changes by countries, but as a whole, very little change. So what's happening here is, and then if we look again at the climate change for just the low-income countries, it's the same thing. So what the finding, as we've seen, is as we go to 2050, the biggest risk is how do we feed 1.8 billion people and a growing economy and changing diets. That's all built into the model. But we have models, so we can do policy assessments. So if you don't like the assessments or the assumptions we made, we can test those. So that's the whole point of a model, testing things and seeing what direction we're on for policy. But we're dominated by population and economic growth. The yields can be significant in local places, but one of the troubles of our maps is it may be bright red where they're only producing 1% of their food from that crop there. So it's red because it's never been good. Sometimes it's red where it is good, and that's going to cause problems. But in all of our models, we're having technological change. So yields are growing because of technology. At the same time, climate is hitting them. So we could still be better off than we are now, but not as good as we could have been without climate change. So as we come here, we see that whatever is happening in climate change by 2050, it's being dampened by technological change and autonomous economic activities. And that's why the work that Sherwin was doing on the bilateral trade is important, that we can shift our partners. And also in the models are the cost of transport. That's one of the things we got from the Martin School at Oxford. They have a transportation model where we're able to look at that. And one big thing we didn't test yet is what if we charge, if there's a price on carbon emissions in the trading world, that's going to change things. So those are things we can look at. So as we come to it, the big question was, locally by 2050, there could be some dramatic issues. We're not saying that. But globally, and by regions and by income classes, it's the growth of economics and population that are driving things and not climate. But the warning is, what about past 2050? You saw that divergent. How do we prepare for that? And just having the possibility of that is affecting countries. I do a lot of work in water systems. How do we build a reservoir if you have a chance of having half the water or twice the water in the future? that cost, you have to prepare for it up front. It's costing developing countries in preparing for that. So so our question as we look forward is, how do we address the vulnerability? And then how do we look past 2050? Should we be doing that? That's a question to you, for proper planning and for equitable climate policy. So we thank you for your time, and we're now excited to, in this context, have our leading experts here, and Greg to take over to have our panel.
Thank you to all of our presenters for the interesting to set us up for this panel discussion. I'm Greg Sixt. I'm a research scientist at the MIT Abdul Latif Jameel Water and Food Systems Lab, where I'm also the research director for food and climate, and I lead the FACT Alliance that Ken mentioned as well. So I'm pleased to today welcome 2 virtual panelists and 1 in-person panelist, and have Ken on the panel as well. So first I'll introduce our virtual panelist, Paula de Almeida. She's an innovation and systems transformation executive focused on sustainable development and food security solutions, as well as the frontiers and resilience of human systems. She currently leads the food and agriculture portfolio for Pegasus Capital Advisors, leading portfolio investments for 2 large sustainable development funds on the Global South and accredited by the UN's Green Climate Fund. Previously, she was the Chief Innovation Officer for Mars Incorporated, preceded by a distinguished leadership career across multiple functions. Known as a systems thinker, managing complex networks, deploying multidisciplinary change in large-scale programs, her current focus is on helping broad acceleration and scale-up of sustainable development goals, solutions across multiple sectors and stakeholders. Our next online panelist is Mark Rosegrant. He's a research fellow emeritus in IFPRI's Director General's Office. He previously served as director of IFPRI's Environment and Production Technology Division. Dr. Rosegrant has extensive experience in research and policy analysis in agricultural and economic development, with an emphasis on water resources and other natural resources and agricultural policy issues as they impact food security, rural livelihoods, and environmental sustainability. He currently directs research on climate change, water resources, sustainable land management, genetic resources, and biotechnology, and agriculture and energy. Finally, our in-person panelist, Ruth Hill, is the Director of Markets, Trade, and Institutions Unit here at IFPRI, and IFPRI's Food and Nutrition Policy Department. She was previously lead economist in the Poverty and Equity Global Practices at the World Bank, where she spent a decade leading work on the distributional impacts of climate change, fiscal policy, markets, and institutions. She also led the development of the World Bank's Rural Income Diagnostics and conducted poverty assessments and systemic country diagnostics in East Africa and South Asia. From 2019 to 2021, she was on external service as the chief economist at the UK government's Centre for Disaster and Protection. So I'm really excited for this group. I think to say we've got a talented and knowledgeable group of folks here. So I'm going to kick us off with a couple questions. So I'm going to ask each panelist to give us just a brief kind of 2-minute response to this question. So the question is, based on your expertise and on what we just heard from the speakers, what jumps out at you about the future of food trade and the impacts of global change on food security? So we'll start with you, Ruth, if that works for you.
Yeah, I think there's a lot that was presented, and it's great to sort of hear more about the work. I think one thing that is really striking is sort of the fact that we're not seeing big changes in the index over time, right? With between a sort of a world in which we have climate change to 2050, and I think that's an interesting point, and I think it's sort of something that we can think about. We can think about, okay, why is that? Is it because some of the underlying pathways are pretty optimistic, or is it that we are just going to see these effects after 2050? And I think it also highlights when we see those results and we contrast it with our perceptions that the risk is increasing, risk of global food insecurity is increasing. It's also useful to sort of take a step back and say, okay, this is useful, this is telling us about sort of what's happening on average over time, but we also need to be thinking about how often with climate change, we're getting a world in which we have riskier outcomes on a year-to-year basis, whilst on average, we may be seeing global food security not changing that much as measured by the index. On a year-to-year basis, this may not be the case. And so how do we start to build that more into our models, and how do we start to think about how we have a global trading system as well as investments in agriculture, research and development, and policy making that allow us to deal with the risk that is increasing and not just the trend effects of climate change.
You're right. That's a really good point about the averages, right? Averages look okay on paper, but when you have a non-average year and it's affecting people, people in the real world, it doesn't feel that average. So that's a really good point you made on that. Mark, I'll go to you. So again, what we've heard from the intro discussions, what jumps out at you about the future of food trade and the impacts of global change on food security?
Hi. Yeah, thanks, Greg. What I wanted to do is, well, that's a big echo I'm hearing, is to look a little bit more at the underlying results from impact that are driving these the results for the Jamil index. And these are based on additional work that IFPRI is doing for the Global Food Outlook report that's coming up. But they're also what's happening in the particular result here for the Jamil index. First, to point out that with declining growth and investment in agriculture R&D, then crop yield growth is slowing over time. So in addition to the modest impact of climate change, you're also getting declining growth rates because of that. At the same time, the increasing incomes, urbanization, and changing tastes in most of the low and middle income countries, there's going to be substantial diet diversification from staples like cereals to fruits and vegetables, meats and oils, and sugar. Of course, that's very mixed effects on diets and nutrition, with partly good and partly bad. It's also good to point out that real commodity prices are projected to increase over time, which puts increasing pressure on food systems, making food more expensive, particularly for low-income countries. An interesting flip for the first time in history really is that the biggest increase in crop-based food consumption will be in sub-Saharan Africa instead of Asia. And as pointed out by Ken, much of that is not going to be met by production. It's also important to notice that financing these large increases in imports in sub-Saharan Africa could be very challenging as well. Progress is made in reducing hunger. Let's focus not only on sort of trade and risk, but the hunger outcomes here. And progress is made for most of the world in reducing hunger, but hunger also remains persistent in many regions, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia as well. And it's good to point out what are some key things driving the hunger results beyond what the models can capture. In particular, as hunger results begin to improve and hunger becomes lower, it actually becomes more difficult to then push it down even lower. And the production-oriented success won't do a lot about that. So we also need to look beyond to broader social protection coverage, in particular to assistance to be provided through things like targeted cash transfers, social insurance, tax-funded social benefits, and so forth. So it's going to be important to integrate those kinds of policies in with the kind of production-oriented policies that are captured here in the analysis.
Thanks, Mark. You hit on a couple points that I have queued up for next. So one is the sub-Saharan Africa, and then the other is the improvement overall in addressing food insecurity, but and to your point, the increase in vulnerability of trade, right? Those potential non-average years. So before we dive in further, I want to give Paolo a chance to respond as well. So Paolo, what jumped out at you and we've talked about this quite a bit you've been with us on this adventure for a while now. What jumps out at you from what you've heard today?
Yeah, thanks. I think to the point that Ruth was making earlier, and some of the points that Mark touched upon as well, is that around the world, when we talk to many countries, there seems to be sort of this very deep concern with food security. There seems to be a widespread emergency belief, and most countries have been talking about that in the context of national security. And yet some of the data doesn't seem to fully create this sort of emergency. And so from a private sector standpoint, when we get information like this, there's 3 phases to action. In this case, even in investment deployment, which is there's the what, the so what, and the now what. Now, we've created a great portfolio of what's, of key data points that allow us to start unpicking and asking more questions. That's the so what. I don't think we're fully done yet with the so what of what this data can do and what it means. And as a result of that, we don't have clarity on the types of recommendations that we need, the private sector particularly, to start driving some of these investments. Now, we talked about the nuances around the regions around the world, and that's something that we take into consideration in our investment strategy, is that every market has a different maturity rate for food and agricultural systems, which means that one size doesn't fit all. And that's very obvious for all the folks that have been fending on the policy front for a very long time, but that hasn't necessarily been the case for how you deploy investments in the private sector. And I think, look, if we are to start having serious problems happening in 2050, you don't want to wait for the problems to hit to then decide when do you start driving the investments. And so my recommendation from this sort of data set is that that capital and that infrastructure needs to start being built right now when we don't have a burning house. And we need to start deploying it, but we also need to explain to the private sector, why is it that we need to drive this level of investment into the system at this moment in time, so that we're prepared for when the overall planet and the overall operating environment fundamentally changes. And I'll just leave it with this. We're in innovation, we often say that there's change comes slowly and then suddenly. And there's sentinels that come, and you may choose to ignore those sentinels, but eventually you will have a burning platform to which will be very difficult for you to do an immediate change to have the right responsive rate, responsive behavior or responsive interventions that will hold your position relative to where you were, right? That's generally what happens in the private sector. The same is going to happen here. When we think about the types of interventions that we need to drive. And we are already seeing materiality risks in the system. And this will impact every single portfolio. Even if you're not invested in food and ag systems, there is exposure. And in fact, actually just last week, it quietly appeared, the European Central Bank just issued a fine for several banks not exposing their materiality risks and exposure to climate. I think we're going to start seeing a little bit more of that behavior happening. And so my question here for these kinds of models, the data is really helpful, but we need to create in the so what bucket for the private sector mechanisms, not to just share the charts and the data, but also what are the implications and the insights, and how should they interpret that data? I think that's the single most important contribution that policy can drive from this.
Thanks, Paula. And Ken, I think what Paula's last point there about, the so what. Do you want to speak to the so what about, what we can learn from these and what the long-term planning, and also I think, Paula, the point you made about the 2050, right? Everything looks okay till 2050, but soon thereafter things go, can potentially get quite worse. So, yeah, I mean, Ken, we've been living and breathing this for a few years, and you've been deeply in the technical side of this. Do you want to speak to Paula's point of kind of that so what component?
Well, I think
What can we learn?
First of all, thank you, all three. Could we just stay for 2 more hours and just talk to us? But one of the things that the Jamil Index started from a seed planted by Community Jamil when they asked Greg and I, what should the Gulf do about food and water under climate change 5 years ago? And we wrote a little 10-page think tank, and they said, could you do that? So we are walking before we run. But one of the things that we want to do, and Tim, who's here, is we have not done enough work on the uncertainty. From other work that we've done, we have to bring in the uncertainty to the model. So we call it the flaw of the averages. And so what we're going to start seeing by 2050, which I don't see here and we did, is we could have the average okay, but we're now having 3 years of bad and 3 years of good, where before we were having 2 and 2. Those are huge. Because, if we go back and look at Joseph and the Technicolor Dreamcoat, what did he have to do? The Nile went up and down, and they had this forecast. Fortunately, it was a perfect forecast. But they stored when they had plenty for when they didn't. So some of the things I think we're going to lean towards in the so what is we're going to have to start building ports for people to export where they aren't exporting and import where they're going to need to. We're going to have to build road infrastructures and transport infrastructure, but maybe we're going to need more food storage because of the variability that's going on. It could lead, and this gets into the big debates, we need more reservoirs. Reservoirs that we're thinking about in Africa for clean energy, for carbon, we may be wanting to do those for irrigation. So we're getting into a lot of tough issues, but I do think in Tim is with me, we have to really get this variability because the average is misleading, but this is the first step. And one of the things we want to take from this as we look about where do we go in the future. And then the other one that everyone sort of addressed a bit is the Jamil Index. We have a side project doing deep dives, and we looked and we were looking at 3 countries. We started out Sudan and Ethiopia, and food security in Sudan is pretty darn bad. Not because of climate, but because of conflict. So that issue, but we then went to Malawi and Ethiopia. And in those cases, where does trade go? How far does trade penetrate? Is it just in the urban areas? Does it go to the rural? So we want to look deep dives, and and Community Jamil is very forward on this, on developing capacity in these countries to do their own analysis, but we need global prices and things to drive that. But I think we need to do more detailed modeling, and this whole idea of variability and regionality need to come in it.
Yeah, and you and I have talked quite a bit about too is the need to look to 2075. Many of these models we developed for 2050, 10, 20 years ago. So at that point, 20 years ago, can we push the models further now towards so that time difference is kind of consistent towards 2075? Paula, I want to put you on the spot a little bit because one thing as the private sector person on the panel, how far out is the private sector planning for this? My sense is that 2050 is probably too far out, but actually, you've talked about this, the concept of what I call a slow surprise, right? You could, if you're paying attention, you could see it building the whole time, but we're surprised when it happens, right? So it's, is the private sector planning far enough out? If you could speak to that.
Yeah, that's a good question. And I was going to respond to your point on 1975 modeling, which is interesting because most investors will hear 2075, not 1975, 2075, and they'll be like, okay, whatever. Like, I don't even know what, where, how, even 2050, right? Even long-term investment portfolios are generally 10 to 12 years, at which point you sort of need to liquidate the assets and return the money to the investors. And in other fronts, which are the frontiers of food systems, especially technology, and in some of the presentations you talked about having to deploy those technologies. Yes, we have a lot of solutions, a lot of innovation in the system, all of which have not been deployed at scale. And at scale is the critical word here, because we operate global food systems that operate at scale. And that is a bus that's moving, and anything new, any change needs to somehow bolt on to that system, even if it's to shift the totality of the system in a new direction, right? And that is the private sector tolerance for that change, to say, look, we do things day in and day out, and especially if you're an end consumer, you're servicing the end consumer, we have to apply conformance to specifications. We cannot skip a beat. We make promises every day to our customers, to our consumers. And anything that needs to change that promise or support that promise needs to operate at the velocity and the scale at which we're delivering. And so when you start looking longer term, you know, it's very difficult for the private sector to start actually financing this well in advance. There are some folks that have a lot of foresight. So for example, there are very few companies and I'm going to use one raw material that I know very well and beloved to many, but there are very few companies that were doubling down and investing R&D and science dollars back in the 1970s and 80s in research institutes in the middle of the place where a crisis was happening with the crash of cocoa, right? Many saw that happening and said, we're just going to shift supply. I think one of the key insights here, and this was the point that Ken just said, is that these changes are happening you know, in a way that we cannot adapt in the short term, right? So from 2 years now, we're seeing bad years happening in 3 years. It might be in 4 years. And that means that you cannot quickly pivot your supply chains or go to different places. Now, cocoa, the world's, unfortunately, a lot of people will be horrified by this. Potentially, we can live without chocolate, but there's some fundamental raw materials to which we cannot, right? They're basic staples that really destabilize not just the food and ag systems, but they actually destabilize social construct, political systems. And so, you know, I think part of what we need to do here is to help the private sector to start investing in the incremental roadmap of change. So you talked about, you know, if we want to see resilient food systems in Africa, we need to start building now the ports that eventually will require the roads. Well, there's going to be an investor that's going to go after the ports, and then that investor needs to be flanked by an investor that's coming for hard infrastructure in partnership with the government, which then is going to start demanding cold, dry storage facilities, which will have investors that will want to focus on that. They will have platforms on that. That sort of assembly of the investor community so that they can understand their timing and their allocation within their portfolios is not happening right now, right? Because they don't see that roadmap of change in this transformation. All we talk about is we need a change. And we don't clarify the tactics of getting that change in place practically with associated amount of dollars to drive that change, because there is no ecosystem orchestrator right now to do that. Everybody is focused on their own space. And then it's very difficult for them to coalesce and start having a cohesive conversation so that they can relay race on this.
Yeah, and actually everyone's focused on their own component. That's part of what drove us to focus on the bilateral trade, is that there really, up till now, up till the Jamil Index, there wasn't a good holistic way to look at who's trading with whom and what happens to the system if there's shocks to it. Now, I'm seeing that we're blowing up online on questions, so I want to get us to questions pretty soon, because there's also a pretty good audience here that I'm sure has some questions. I've seen some nods and some raised eyebrows as we've been talking. But I do want to hit on one point from my IFPRI colleagues here, is, you know, in the Ken spaghetti diagrams, we saw, you know, yes, you know, between now and 2050, that largely speaking, food security is improving almost across the board, but that vulnerability to food trade imports, right? So that vulnerability of the ability to continue to import food to meet demand is increasing in you know, especially in low and lower middle income countries. Paula mentioned about staple crops and how we can have destabilizing effects. Are we planning enough? Do we need to plan for potential changes in staple crops? You know, we've changed our staple crops in the past. I mean, you know, so are we planning enough for that? And so I'll start with you, Ruth, and then Mark's online as well. So this is actually going pretty well, this hybrid arrangement. I just want to give a shout out to the IFPRI folks and how well you guys are managing a hybrid setup. It's not easy. So Ruth, what are your thoughts on that? And I guess also kind of what kind of tools do we need to plan for that?
So the question here is sort of, what do we do now for post?
What do we do now for
2050?
a world in which we may need to have significant dietary change on
Yeah.
our staples?
So I was thinking, I think Paul has sort of laid out very clearly the constraint, right? Which is whatever we do now has to sort of, even if we're doing it for the future, it sort of has to make sense for now also. Otherwise, there's going to be no one to do it. It's not that we have governments with super long time horizons at the moment either. It's hard to find the person that's thinking of, how to invest beyond 2050, right?
Yeah.
So what do we do now that makes sense now and also sets us up well for the future?
Yeah.
And I think there's a lot of things that fall into this category. And I think I kind of like to think of them around how we reduce our risk today can also set us up really well for sort of a world which looks really different tomorrow. And
Yeah.
so what are some of these things? So some of these things are reducing some of the risks to production. I'm going to focus on Africa in what I say.
Yep.
So here I'm thinking about investments in soil quality and in water management. These are things that are going to help farmers in those bad years today. They're going to help farmers every year, and they're definitely going to help farmers in those bad years that are the non-average years in the run-up to 2050. And it's also no regrets. Like it's better soils and better water management is going to help us beyond that. And I think that we are increasingly doing work on, okay, what are those practices? What are those investments that bring you a return, like that do increase the quality of soils, do increase your water management, do have some return today, and are also ideally resilience increasing in that they're reducing your downside risk also. So I think we're getting a sense of some of these things that have a return. Now, sometimes the return isn't quick enough for somebody to invest in it right now. And so I think that's where we can really be looking at, okay, how do we address some of the market constraints that might be limiting the financing of that? Is that through bringing in a little bit of carbon financing? Is it through having some creative financial arrangements? Is it through addressing some of the other constraints? So some of the other constraints or other ways to sort of take risk out of the system today that will help us in the future, I think trade is a massive one. I think a lot of what constrains investment in some of the things that we were talking about and other things is the high costs of trade. Again, I'm going to focus on Africa, high cost of trade in Africa, and the way that reduces the net return to the investor because their output price to their input price is out of whack, and also increases risk in the system because you just end up with a bunch of markets that aren't integrated. The Jameel Index has some nice insights on this. We have other work at IFPRI that also has insights on this, other indices. But actually, I want to talk about a paper that's, outside of not Jameel, not IFPRI, but I think really insightful on this, which is a paper done by somebody called Obi Porcius, where he looks at the point you raised, which is, okay, what happens when you bring in the internal cost of trading within some of these countries in Africa as well? And you look both at that and the cost of trading across Africa, so intercontinental trade, and the cost of trading between Africa and the rest of the world. And he shows that you can get, a big, in a world with climate change, you can get big gains in welfare by addressing all three, and they're about a third, proportionately. But the biggest of these three bits, the biggest is addressing internal costs to trade. So addressing the fact that it costs you 10 times as much to move goods into markets in Nigeria than it does to move goods into markets in the US. So addressing that, addressing the intercontinental trade within Africa, and also connecting Africa better to the rest of the world. These are things that are going to help us manage the risk today. They're also going to help set us up for whatever's coming post-2050. And then the last point is sort of speaking to something that Mark raised, which is that, however much we can do now to try and take risk out of the system, there's going to be some risk remaining. And so we need to be thinking of how can you help farmers, traders manage that risk. And for some people, as Mark mentioned, that's going to be social protection. For others, it's going to be insurance schemes. We can't expect, governments are not going to, I mean, social protection coverage rates in Africa are like around 2% today. We cannot expect this to suddenly scale up. There's a lot of other things governments in Africa need to be spending money on. But there is a role for that. We need to think about what's that role, but we also need to think about what are some financial market mechanisms that allow individuals, private individuals, to be managing this risk as well. So I put it in those three, and I think it's not going to answer everything, but it's going to set us up. Before handing over to Mark, and hopefully Mark will pick up on some of these things, but I think in addition, we have to be investing in ag R&D.
Yes.
And, you know, this can be a game changer. It's been a game changer in the past. Look at the Green Revolution. I mean, that is like, you know, if you had been doing these projections before the Green Revolution, you wouldn't have imagined in your scenario where we got to today with the Green Revolution. This can really fundamentally change things, and we have to be doing that work in ag R&D, but we have to be addressing these other three challenges so that actually that ag R&D gets adopted. That's a lot of the issue in Africa today, is that there are innovations out there that are not getting adopted, and it's because of those three things that I mentioned. Sorry, I went on a bit more than 2 minutes.
No worries. I would love to read that paper, so if you could share that with us. Yeah. Mark, I'm going to give you kind of the final word before we go to questions. And there's so much I wanted to ask that I haven't even gotten to. But Mark, you've been sitting there patiently and quietly.
Let me keep this very short, but I'll build on also on some of the things Ruth just said. So I think it's going to be really important to start implementing broad-based climate smart technologies. And it's very difficult to do, but I think we have to push harder now. These include things like moving larger scale into carbon payments for carbon conserving technologies such as conservation tillage, water management, especially for rice, which has huge methane emissions, and improved livestock management. Plant breeding that is going to be essential. The R&D is also mentioned by Ruth, that reduces carbon emissions by improving crop nitrogen use efficiency and by sequestering more carbon in the soil. You know, looking at improving photosynthesis. There's a lot of exciting things out there, but again, it's going to take a lot of private and public investment. Also need to promote reforestation and forest conserving policies, which can significantly sequester carbon. And also beyond these kind of micro level issues, there has to be a lot of work on reducing agricultural subsidies for fertilizer and other insecticides and others that promote carbon-intensive crops using high levels of fertilizer, as well as livestock. All these things, though, of course, are very difficult to do. They would have been done by now. We need better delivery systems and incentives to adopt these kinds of things because they're not necessarily going to be profitable in the short run. So that's going to take a broad-based policy effort on top of the technology and research investments.
Thanks, Mark. One thing, the elephant in the room we haven't talked about, which deserves its own panel, is the fact that the U.S. just threw off the entire global trade system. And that does warrant an entire separate event. So stay tuned for that one. I just do want to also note our colleague Keith Wiebe, who has helped us develop this and who is an IFPRI colleague. He had a comment. So he said, it's important to note that climate change is projected to have significant impacts, but these are overshadowed by the implications of growth in population and incomes, especially in sub-Saharan Africa. So thank you for that comment, Keith. I don't think he's not in the room, so he's somewhere in the building sending us comments. Oh, he's in Wisconsin, okay. So let's do some questions, because I have a feeling there's a lot. So there's a microphone in the center. Is it on, or do we need to turn it on? We got to turn it on. So just step up to the mic. Let me get this turned on for you. And then oh, it's on. You can ask the question to anyone in the panel, and then also panelists at some point you can ask for each other questions. And while the questions are being asked here, I'll see what we got online.
Sure. Will Martin from MTI. Thanks very much for great presentations, really exciting work, and I've learned a whole lot from it. One thing, I'm a little uneasy about the emphasis on the risks of imports. I worry that policymakers may take away a message that, oh, we've got to be autarkic. and that it could end up exposing themselves to vastly greater risk. I want to pick up on Ruth's point that this year to year or several years, Ken's point, risks. We know that countries can be furiously exporting, like Ireland in 1848, and 15% of the population died. There are a lot of vulnerabilities there, as Amartya Sen pointed out. And I suspect a lot of these questions are addressed somewhere in the project. Perhaps they didn't fully come through. I'd love to hear more. Or perhaps they're exciting new research agenda items on which I think there could be a lot of collaboration within IFPRI. But thank you very much.
Thank you. You're welcome to step up to the mic. I will hit a question online real quick. Ken, this is probably more for you or for us. This is from Sarag Alden Badr. For the Jamil Index, have you tested what happens when today's uncertainties in trade and currency systems become actual risks? For example, through new tariffs, supply chain gatekeeping, or BRICS-style settlements affecting food security? I'm smirking because we have a paper we're working on BRICS. Yeah.
So I think there's two things. We know that all models are wrong and some are useful. And one of the things that I see this project being is less about providing answers than highlighting issues. And so this idea of food, so I'm going to Will, your question as well. We're pointing out that there is a push, and one of the things sort of in Africa is a lot of work we did was we want to protect the environment, and wetlands are really important in Uganda, but they're getting eaten up literally to make food. So if we want to protect them, how are you going to make food? It's okay to import to protect the environment, but that brings other risks. So for me, the big issue for us as policymakers are these moral dilemmas we're having across many frontiers, and how are we trading off between risks, various risks. So the tool is simple to point that out, and when you go online, you can weight any of the 5 indicators and get a new index. You can weight it from 0, you can change the relative weights, and then what we're hoping to do is to dive into countries. So pointing it out, and for me, it's the Human Development Index is very simple, but it's powerful, or the SDGs are simple, but they help us get our priorities together and understand these things. So I hope there's a whole generation of research that goes on because of the tool. And then also what we're seeing happening is the tool is a framework that brings up a question, and then the whole point of the FACT Alliance is people across many disciplines that can come together like this panel. And if somebody has a question from an NGO or a corporation, we can then marshal these people together to answer it. That's why we have so many people on that. And that's, you can ask Greg and I, that adds an overhead that we had to have meetings at 4 in the morning or 8 at night, you all know, in the CG Center. But that's worth it. It's worth it. So I think that's where we're going. And then getting the tool to be at some point, this is a charge to the CG Center and to IFPRI. This is the worst possible time to talk about getting more money into the system when it's collapsing and shrinking because of funding for development. So we need more information at this time of crisis than less. So it's a call out to whoever's listening, and we're going to be putting it in, pushing forward to, going to 20. We know that IFPRI is smart enough and wants to do 2075 and 2100 with impact. Show me the beef. Where's the money to do that in the world of shrinking budget? So, but what are the priorities? So I think we want to go there. So, love to hear your.
Just
Greg.
yes. Where's that?
Sorry,
Paula. Yes.
I just wanted to, the point that Ken's making is really important, because oftentimes, and again, I'm giving a private sector lens on it. For all of these regions, it needs to be fit for purpose, fit for context. And it's, when we talk about Africa, it's for Africa by Africa, because they know their problems, they live it all day long, and therefore they need to take the best knowledge that's out there. And the same thing for the Amazon. When we talk about reforestation and preservation of and conservation, there's deep empathy, and we talked about these philosophical trade-offs that happen in policy. You know, there's a reality as to why the forest is being eaten up, right? Just as the same situation, it happens in the Amazon, it happens in Uganda. And so I just want us also to think about, when we consider policy, that we're doing it on the ground and not from afar, because it's built on the reality and the constraints of that system. And by the way, that the models are actually modeling the outcomes and the consequences of policy that they come out. We have large computational power right now in the system. We should be able to do that, right? Simulation models to say, if we were to implement X, Y, and Z, what would happen to the system based on what we know? I think that's just my caution, because oftentimes we will propose policy that will actually become a barrier to investment. And I've seen that in many places, and that's sometimes you have to unwind some of those policies so that you can then unlock the flow of investment.
Thank you. And then we have a question from the audience, but just before we go to your question, I just want it for people listening, not everyone's familiar with what we mean when we say BRICS. So it's a trade bloc of nations. BRICS stands for Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa. There's been additional countries that have been added to it, and they account for about 40% of food trade. Okay, 40% of food exports. Okay. Please introduce yourself and ask your question.
Yeah, hi, Charlotte Hebebrand, also from IFPRI. So really, really interesting conversation. And I think we've established that both the private sector and politicians don't necessarily think up to 2050, never mind 2075. So I think it's the job of all of us, right? The research community, and I think people like Paula, who are sort of, advising the private sector on what to be thinking about in the longer run. So I hope we can work with you to make a pitch for some funding for us to do that really, really important work. And then I also really wanted to emphasize Ruth's point on social protection, right? Yes, we can think about all the risks in the world. We can't address them all. So we do need some basic measures that are safety nets. And I just want to point to, all of you are probably aware of this, but I thought it was really interesting that one of the outcomes from the COP in Brazil is the Belém Declaration, which is almost entirely dedicated to social protection. So a really, really important point, I think, there. And then I have two questions for you. One is on trade, right? Your graph shows that Africa, by and large, is going to be importing more in the future in order to stay food secure. That's not what we hear when you go to Africa. There's a lot of talk about sovereignty, food sovereignty, and so on. So what is happening there? And then on climate change, the fact that we're saying by 2050, climate change isn't really that big of a deal. How do we communicate that? Also maybe in light of Bill Gates' recent letter on the climate, and these are all tricky things. So I'd just be curious to get the panel's views on that. Thanks.
Thanks. And actually, you did a great job integrating in the question that was online that you didn't even know was the next question. So I'm gonna mix this in that we can reply to. So it's ultimately this. I was going to ask a question too on. There's a lot of discussion around making Africa, sub-Saharan Africa especially, a net food exporter. We've discussed the need for imports to meet food demand. We've had a few questions now on the increased momentum towards regenerative agriculture and the agroecological movement, which I do believe quite firmly in myself as someone who worked on that in East Africa. On the one hand, it may reduce yield. There's a transition period. On the other, increased resilience. This plays into food sovereignty. So I'm kind of mixing these together and giving you guys a chance to just kind of speak more broadly about how important is climate change, what role does Africa play, sub-Saharan Africa play in this food security, and then what is that balance of domestic versus, did I tie those together well enough, or are they too disparate?
Let me ask a specific question to drive that.
Sure.
And Mark, I think you may be the best one, if not Faika and Sherwin. We're using the standard IFPRI assumptions in the model. What's driving, Mark, to meet the food supply of Africa by 2050, we're seeing imports? Is it the rate, you talked about yields not growing the same way. Is that something we can test in the model? And what are the assumptions that are in the model that are leading us to that?
I mean, yeah, fundamentally, that it's impossible to grow productivity, at least in the short run, fast enough to meet the rapidly growing demand in sub-Saharan Africa. That there's still very fast population growth, as you showed, in sub-Saharan Africa. And there's also renewed income growth, which is, of course, a great thing, but it does lead to higher imports. I think just echoing what Will said from the audience, we have to be very careful about trying to push that Africa should become an exporter or self-sufficient. Because the only way to do that, at least until massive changes have been made in investments and productivity growth, is through trade restrictions, tariffs that are going to end up creating very high domestic costs of production and therefore very high prices to African consumers compared to import costs. So I think it's not a good idea to sort of encourage exports on a broad scale in Africa, other than, there's certainly niche crops that they have a comparative advantage, but that's not, to me, a useful goal nor a attainable goal without very negative costs to African consumers and welfare.
Thank you. We're gonna take one more question from the audience, and then we're gonna have to wrap up because we're hitting the end of the time. So next,
Hi, my name
we'll
is
do 2 questions from the audience.
my
if
name
we
is
can keep it
Dan
quick.
Silverstein. I'm a private sector advisor in agricultural development. So I think in terms of the private sector, and I'm going to change the context of the direction of the conversation a bit. I have in my hand a DevEx article from November 13th explaining how the State Department is changing its approach to global health, in which it will no longer have healthcare delivery through implementing partners, but they'll go directly through the private sector. I'm still framing this in my own mind, but if we try to find a corollary with food security, let's say, for instance, Plumpy Nut. And I've been listening to you talking about strategic planning and establishing cost of capital and anticipating growth in markets. It seems to me that if we go to this model with food security, where there are no implementing partners and there's no underlying grant proposals from donor aid agencies, it's really going to be survival of the fittest, is it not? Have you thought at all about this? And what happens if global food security simply goes through the private sector and capital flows downhill? So whoever has the greatest gross margins and the greatest growth prospects is going to have the greatest food security, and anybody who doesn't is going to starve. Yes or no?
We have talked about this. Way to lead us in on a hot topic towards the end here, Dan.
Well, I'm sorry, I knew that.
Yep. No. I mean,
But there's a hot mic, and I had.
you got to go for it. You got to go for it.
You got it. Do with it what you want.
Who wants to take that one? Yeah, we'll take the last question, and then we'll tie them together.
Hi, everyone. My name is Comfort. I am a graduate of Master of Food Security. So when I heard food security, I thought, yeah, this is the right place to be. I came in from Australia, by the way,
Okay.
and I'm Nigerian. So hearing this conversation actually resonates deeply with me. And I have a few questions based on my firsthand experience in Nigeria, working in the food space, and also from my master's degree. So first, so I've been having this ongoing conversation with the National Agricultural Development Fund. It's a new fund set up by the Nigerian government, and also looking at the dynamics of the food system in Nigeria and in other African countries, and the global context, looking at the trade relationships. So I love when it was Paola who said, for African by Africans. I totally agree with her, because again, if we're looking at the funding landscape and the fact that, number one, the African Union actually do have a Maputo Declaration where Africans themselves are expected to make commitments of 10% of their budgetary allocation to agriculture and food security. And that's not happening for Africa by Africa. So if we're looking at long-term investment in Africa and de-risking the food sector, that has to happen, because otherwise the continent would be suffering from food insecurity while trying to, go into trade relations within the continent and across the continent. So it's an issue that should be looked into. Again, there's a lot of institutions, both private and government, working in silos within these countries in the continent. So there has to be like strengthening collaboration across them, sharing data. The data are there, but it's just in silos across these institutions. So there has to be that kind of support system that would, stimulate that level of cooperation. And lastly, how do we ensure that the role of African countries in expanding, this food trade do not really compromise their need for securing food for themselves? Thank you.
Thank you. We are like almost out of time, so I want to give our colleagues based in Africa who are speaking to us from South Africa right now, Sherwin and Faika, do you want to respond to the last set of questions on that? Or I just want to give you first right of denial or first right of approval on that. Before we close out, because we are going to be just shut down pretty soon. So, anybody? In 1 minute or less. Yeah.
1 minute or less. Wow. So I think it's in Africa it's a difficult situation. We have really low starting yields. What we're finding from the modeling work that we're doing is that yields are growing, but it's not fast enough in order for us to produce enough food in order to meet the increasing demand. There are a lot of trade-offs on resources. So I do think that, like I said earlier, there is no one size fits all for all African countries when we're thinking about how we're going to be doing this and how we're going to be securing food for ourselves. And I do sort of feel that solely relying only on ourselves to produce food might not be the right choice, and looking at how do we strengthen ties, and not necessarily when we're thinking about trade with other countries, we should be thinking also about regional trade and how do we strengthen that, and how do we sort of strengthen our own agricultural and food processing value chains within the continent in order to support the continent as a whole, as opposed to countries being silos and not working and benefiting from each other's strengths. Thanks.
Thanks. I think that's going to close us out. And we've talked a lot about regional trade within the continent as well. So we are out of time. I want to thank our panelists. I want to thank our audience. This has been a really great conversation. The 90 minutes blew by. We are going to be here. There's some coffee and pastries for those of us who are here in person. We're here. We can talk. Online, if you have questions for the Jameel Index team, the website is jameelindex.mit.edu. There's a place there for comments. Just be patient with our response rate on that. Sometimes Ken and I get, we're traveling a lot, so we might be a little slow in response, but we will respond. So thank you, everyone. This is wonderful. Please give the panelists a round of applause and the speakers. Thank you, everyone.